thank you all for coming. It's really great to see some new faces. And there'll be probably a few more joining us as we're moving along. But we're really, really happy to welcome Rogney today, because he's made a lot of studies of the Ilyenkov texts and written about them, and also in relation to Engels, is the kind of legacy of Engels, and which is of great importance, and especially in this year of the anniversary. So I won't go on any longer, but just to say we'll have about half an hour of Rogney, and then they'll be open up for discussion and questions, and Rogney can have a chance to reply as well. So over to you, Rogney.
Okay, thank you. So I will try to read this as quickly as I can, although my English is not as good as I wish. So I ask for your benevolence there. Okay, so Ilyenkov has been the subject of increasing attention in the recent years in Russia and the West. This resurgence is certainly welcomed by the small but steadily growing number of his followers. However, as part of this phenomenon, several scholars, perhaps in an attempt to bring Ilyenkov into dialogue with contemporary Western philosophical tradition, have embraced the, in my opinion, incorrect view that his philosophy bears striking similarities to certain currents in Western Marxism. Ilyenkov is suffering the same treatment that Western Marxism gave to Marx himself. The way to desobitize him was to separate him from the supposed author of Diamat, Engels. So it is true that one of the main themes that runs through Ilyenkov's works is his struggle against scientism, especially technocracy. However, this struggle by no means undermines the importance of science or the deep respect according to a science founded on the dialectical materialist world outlook. For the latter is the most scientific worldview. This is clearly incompatible. This view is clearly incompatible with the let's say, John Holloway view, who thinks that the notion of Marxism as a science implies an anti-democratic and determinism quietism. Holloway sees Marxist dialectics as a pure negative reason of revolt, and he puts his faith in the screen of fighting capitalism by this means. Ilyenkov not only explicitly rejects such notion of negative dialectics, but advances a fundamentally different view. When Ilyenkov deals with the problem of the relation between the feelings of social discontent and the scientific consideration of social phenomena, he bases his analysis upon Engels' remarks that although Marx did not ground his communist demand on subjective rejection of capitalist injustice by the masses, moral consciousness is often a sign of real unsolved contradictions that economic science must address. From Ilyenkov's perspective, I quote, "An authentic science and an authentically high level of morality cannot but coincide in the very essence. They cannot stand in juxtaposition." End of quote. This is why Ilyenkov rejects the juxtaposition between science and humanism. The fundamental incompatibility here between Ilyenkov and Western Marxism lies in the very understanding of the communist ideal. While Western Marxists typically lack a positive understanding of such an ideal and inevitably arrive to a pessimistic eternal postponement of its practical realization, Ilyenkov insists that I quote, "communism becomes a reality just to the extent that each individual becomes a fully developed personality, and the realization of the communist ideal can in no case be left for tomorrow. It must be done today, now." End of quote. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of Western Marxism, besides his structural, his structural divorce from political science, was his rejection of Engels' Dialectics of Nature. The dismissal of nature and the sciences that study it as a field of no philosophical interest was his common motto ever since the publication of Lukács' early book, History and Class Consciousness, where he's argued that nature is a societal category, and the whole drift of the book tends to show that only a knowledge of society and the men who live in it is of relevance to philosophy. Some scholars present the young Lukács as a precursor to Ilyenkov. In this way, by noting the importance of Lukács to this anti-Dymak tradition in Soviet philosophy, Marif invites us to examine a very important contact point with Western Marxism. That was a quote, by the way, of Alex Levant in his introduction to the Dialectics of the Ideal. That view, in my opinion, is mistaken. The Lukács who is closer to Ilyenkov historically and philosophically is not the Lukács claimed by Western Marxism, that is the Lukács of the 1920s, but the older Lukács, the Lukács of the John Hegel from the late 40s. And along with other works of the late 50s and 60s. Ilyenkov scholars almost unanimously claim that Ilyenkov rejected the older Lukács, particularly the ontology of social being. This view is also incorrect. Perhaps those scholars are most disquieted by the sound of the word ontology than by the specific content that Lukács grants to it. Ilyenkov acknowledged that in his, he wrote a review of that book, by the way, and there he acknowledged that the term ontology appears as a synonym for the objectivity of dialectics, both of dialectics of nature and the dialectics of the historical processes. And this is, of course, an idea 100% supported by Ilyenkov, who repeated numerous times that dialectics does, I quote, does not apply to human history alone. In nature, as well as in thinking, the real dialectical development takes place in the same manner, and it cannot be otherwise. End of quote. In his review, far from rejecting Lukács' book, Ilyenkov described a completely necessary and very substantial critical analysis of Hegel's science of logic from the point of view of dialectics materialism. Moreover, Ilyenkov sees in it a critique precisely to the voluntarist and subjectivist trends present in history and class consciousness. At the end of his review, Ilyenkov arrives at what Western Marxism sees as a forbidden conclusion. I quote, a correct understanding of natural dialectics, thus, acts as a necessary prerequisite for the dialectics of social being, that is, social development. In other words, from the Marxist point of view, social consciousness presupposes social being. But for Ilyenkov, the story does not end there. In turn, social being presupposes natural pre-human being. Ilyenkov's attitude towards natural science can only be correctly understood after considering his views on the proper subject matter of philosophy. For Ilyenkov, as Majdansky correctly claims, philosophy is a science of the ideal. But this does not mean that for him, philosophy is nothing else but logic, deprived of ontology. Ontology and gnoseology formed for Ilyenkov a dialectical unity, which he, following Lenin, liked to call logic with a capital L. And here ontology refers to the objective structure of material reality. Strictly speaking, even if we take the term thought in an objective sense, the thesis of logic as a science of pure thought, of thought about thought, is directly related to objective idealism. For Hegel, this thesis makes complete sense, since he only sees in reality the alienation of the spirit, of thought. Even when he addresses reality, he thinks about it as thought in its otherness. Thus, when the objective idealist talks about the identity of thinking and being, he is really talking about the identity of thought with itself. Therefore, for Ilyenkov, logic is not just thought about thought, not the science of the forms of thought external to nature and history, but, I quote, the laws of development of all material, natural, and spiritual things. That is, the development of the entire concrete content of the world and of its cognition. End of quote. It is precisely this ontological content that sets the boundaries between philosophy as logic with a capital L and the rest of the sciences that study thought as a specific phenomenon. Ilyenkov-Lenin's thesis of the unity of dialectics, logic, and the theory of knowledge, far from rejecting Engels' well-known definition of dialectics as the science of the general laws of development of reality and thought, actually presupposes, from the angle of materialism, I quote Ilyenkov, therefore, logic also investigates the forms and laws that equally govern both thinking about the external world and thinking about thought itself. And it is thus the science of the universal forms and patterns of thought and reality. End of quote. Following this Engelsian principle, Ilyenkov identified the general laws of the reflection of being in thought as the subject matter of philosophical dialectics. Without a conscious appropriation of materialistic dialectics by natural science, they will be incapable of meeting the logical requirements demanded by their object. Consequently, a speculative metaphysical philosophy as the complement of such a lack of theoretical proficiency could not be overcome. This is the main goal behind Engels' unfinished Dialectics of Nature, to overcome a speculative philosophy as the metaphysics by providing to positive science a philosophical logic, while negating its speculative nature as the queen of sciences, conserves all the achievement of the philosophy's history. Meanwhile, Western Marxists, in their rejection of the dialectics of nature, secretly profess a blind idolatry towards positivistic views on this subject matter, which they uncritically accept. Far away from Western Marxism, neo-Kantian divorce between social and natural sciences, and between both of them and philosophy, Ilyenkov sees that the only way to realize Marx's project of a single science is through Engels' invitation towards a fraternal collaboration among philosophy and the other sciences. As it is well known, Ilyenkov put in practice the idea of the alliance of philosophy and science, especially in the fields of psychology, defectology, and pedagogy. Indeed, the most fruitful of these collaborations was his participation in the well-known Zagor's experiment, in which he assisted as its philosophical mentor. But Ilyenkov also collaborated with natural scientists in a very active fashion. Ilyenkov organized a circle of physicists in the Institute of Philosophy. He was then interested in how the Platonic universal forms in the foundation of physics compete with the democratic approach to this matter. Ilyenkov assisted Nobel Prize winner Nikolai Semenov at least once a week for 2 months on his understanding of dialectics. Such collaborations were not only beneficial to the scientists who engaged with Ilyenkov himself also profited. The greatest influence, perhaps, was his friend Povich Kuznetsov. Inspired by some of his inquiries into the thermal death of the universe and the anti-entropic function of life, Ilyenkov, in a widely creative fashion, developed some key notions of Engels' Dialectics of Nature in an early manuscript that has lately gathered a lot of attention, the Cosmology of the Spirit. The most overwhelming evidence of Engels' influence upon Ilyenkov thought can be found in his posthumously published manuscript from his youth, Cosmology of the Spirit. In this text, Ilyenkov advances the hypothesis that humanity, as the bearer of nature's highest products, shall intentionally restart the cosmic cycle of the universe history by actively rescuing it from its spontaneous thermal death. Incredibly, even here, Engels' influence on Ilyenkov is often overlooked or even explicitly denied. Witness Giuliano Vivaldi, translator of cosmology into English, who says, Engels, I quote, Engels of malignant dialectics of nature clearly provides the citational husk for Ilyenkov cosmology, although it is not necessarily the source of the central concepts in Ilyenkov's text. However, perhaps the three most significant influences to be found in the text are those of Spinoza, Russian cosmism, and of course Hegel, whose terminological presence is fundamental. End of quote. This, it seems to me, is an attempt to cover the sun with one finger, as we say in Cuba. Ilyenkov does not draw his cosmological views directly from Spinoza and Hegel. According to Ilyenkov, it is Engels' dialectical materialism that restored the simple and profound statement of Bruno and Spinoza in a rational form. That last thing was a quote, by the way, from the Cosmology of the Spirit. Ilyenkov constantly amends the metaphysical and idealistic positions of both Spinoza and Hegel in the light of Engels' Dialectics of Nature. First, Ilyenkov's cosmology is incompatible with Spinoza's mechanistic determinism, as he grants ontological status to chance in nature. Following Engels, Ilyenkov does not understand contingency as a subjective illusion grounded in our ignorance, Spinoza's position, but as a real manifestation of a real manifestation of necessary processes. For Ilyenkov, as for Engels, while thought or the thinking matter is a necessary attribute of nature, its contingent bearer in the current cycle, that is, for example, humankind, is nothing but another of its expendable modes. This is, of course, a logical result of placing contingency within the furniture of nature. Otherwise, Ilyenkov's views of the necessary arrival of thought would imply that each cosmic cycle will be identical to the others. This flexibility is what distinguishes his hypothesis from both Nietzsche's eternal return and the Stoic doctrine of the universal conflagration. Something similar happens with the ideological nonsense, as Ilyenkov calls it, of Hegel mystical terminology, theology of the word spirit. Dialectical materialism, Ilyenkov writes, completely cast off the idea of any aim of the existence of the universe whatsoever, resolving the issue of the aim into the category of the universal interaction. Here again, Ilyenkov, materialist critical of Hegel, really relies on Engels' dialectics as the science of universal interaction. Moreover, the historical dialectical conception of nature required by Ilyenkov's cosmology, which implies the development of new forms of organization and movement through time, cannot be directly deduced from Hegel. From the latter, as Engels noted, nature, as a mere alienation of the idea, is incapable of development in time, capable only of extending its manifoldness in space, so that it displays simultaneously and alongside one another all the stages of development comprised in it, and is condemned to an eternal repetition of the same processes. Nor could Ilyenkov have found such an historic picture of nature in Spinoza, who believed that modes are capable of changing only according to fixed and immutable laws. Only modes change. God's attributes are immutable. Indeed, from such perspective, one is not entitled to talk, as Ilyenkov does, about the emergence of regularities within nature and the very emergence of thought, the highest project of universal development, will be an equivalent to a miracle. Meanwhile, Engels, from whom the laws are the form of the universality in nature, understand that despite their objectivity, those are not pure immutable laws, but historically developed tendencies inherent to nature. Hence, it is only through Engels' dialectics and not directly from Spinoza and Hegel that one could arrive to the monist and yet historical conception that matter remains the same in all his transformation, that none of its attributes can never be lost. However, when Ilyenkov treats the problem Moreover, when Ilyenkov treats the problem of the place of the ideal within nature, he starts from Engels' Spinozist insight that thought is not a purely accidental, expendable phenomenon, but a necessary attribute of nature, and science. And since nature never loses any of its attributes through its historical changes, one can state that matter constantly possesses thought, constantly thinks itself. It is true that Ilyenkov went much further than Engels in his intrepid phantasmagoria, as he called it. Engels himself did not imagine Ilyenkov's science fiction scenario of the cosmic reboot. However, it is clear that Ilyenkov's cosmological conception of the role of the spirit within nature is based upon Engels' principle of the hierarchy of matter, immanent forms of movement in which thought occupies the highest level. Ilyenkov's Cosmology of the Spirit was not indeed intended for publication, although Ilyenkov never disavowed it. And this was most likely due to its highly speculative and certainly not because of its debt to Engels, for precisely those Engels'al premises rejected by Western Marxism are the ones that Ilyenkov proudly retained in his more mature work. Ilyenkov's conception of the ideal is simultaneously an effort to overcome both physiological reductionism and philosophical idealism. Following Engels, he opposes his view to the mechanistic materialism that deals with the problem of the ideal by simply identifying thought with the material, physiological processes occurring inside our heads. Ilyenkov rightfully rejects this mechanistic view, for the ideal confronts the individual as a fully objective system of representation. Thus, Ilyenkov conceives the ideals the ideal as a strictly social phenomenon. That is, a phenomenon that can only arise within social conditions. Because of this, he is so fond of Engels' idea that the specifically human form of thought, the self-conscious dialectical thinking, only appears at a high level of socio-historical development, with the social condition emergence of philosophical dialectics as a form of critical reflection of thought upon its own forms of reflection. However, to say that the idea only exists within social conditions does not mean that it is unrelated to nature, not only because it depends on physiological preconditions, but also and mainly because the content of our idealizations. Consider Ilyenkov's views on scientific objects. For Ilyenkov, it is clear that the materialist position on this issue consists of, I quote, the thesis that mathematics, like any science, investigates the real material world, even though it examines the world from its own special perspective, end of quote. But this does not mean that mathematical objects or any ideal objects are mere copies or representations of material objects as they appear in nature, for nature never produces a purely ideal, perfect form. The ideal is not simply a representation of another object, but of its universal nature. It is if the idea were understood only as the representation by means of a material object of another material object, or even of a class of multiple material objects, and then we would not be talking about an idealization of such objects, but as a merely formal classification, a purely symbolic and therefore more or less arbitrary designation. What is idealized in the form of a concept is not a set of traits for some unknown reason repeated in a group of phenomena. That is not an external, abstract, subjectively identified similarity that we find in a group of phenomena, but real material relations, the regular interactions that things have between them as part of a concrete objective totality. Interaction as the form of the unity of the concrete universal in opposition to the abstract universal is carried out not through identity, but through difference, opposition, and contradiction. And these dialectical interactions within a concrete historical totality are not, according to Ilyenkov, the privilege of social formation, but a truly general, universal form. That is, the form by which all development, natural and social, is realized. Ilyenkov states that human labor includes all other forms and types of movement of matter at its abstract moments and takes place in conformity with their laws. The general laws governing man's change of nature, therefore, are also general laws of the change of nature itself, revealed by man's activity and not by orders foreign to it, dictated from outside. Therefore, the ideal social reproduction of nature presupposes the existence of objective forms of relations and development, laws of motion that are not imposed on nature but reflected from it by practical activity. Those natural laws constitute the basis of our successful transformation of nature according to a conscious plan and not the other way around. As Ilyenkov puts it, I quote, ideality thus has a purely social nature and origin, and yet the ideal, in the form of knowledge, reflects objective reality, which exists independently of humanity. In conclusion, Ilyenkov Oh, what was that? I don't know what I'm doing here. In conclusion, Ilyenkov conception of the ideal is the central thread that weaves through the rich philosophy of his. In this presentation, I have tried to show the central role played by Engels in Ilyenkov thought, understanding philosophy not as the sole producer of a worldview, but as logic, as the logic of its positive development, presupposes the materialist understanding of the ideal as a form of reflection of the objective, concrete, universal forms of the interaction of matter. Although the ideal only emerges within social conditions, it is a necessary attribute of nature, which is its final ontological substance. These are Engels's premises of Ilyenkov's views on the ideal as the subject matter of philosophy, as the key to understanding philosophy's relations with the other sciences, as the highest and irreducible attribute of matter, and as the product of labor that presupposes nature universal interaction, revealing its intrinsic structure. They show where Ilyenkov really stands in relation to Western Marxism projection of the dialectics of nature. And the fundamental difference is that while Western Marxism was a project of defeat with the only negative purpose of criticizing what it is, without offering any positive alternative, creative Soviet Marxists, such as Ilyenkov, were focused on constructing the ideal, the real ideal communist form of social life. Indeed, revolution for Ilyenkov was not simply a question, but above all, an answer. So that's it. Thank you for endure to the end of this.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Can you close your screen? Well, yeah, thanks.
I think that here in the red button. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, so it's over to Kirill to moderate. Yeah.
Well, it's over to all of you. If you have a question or a point of discussion, you could either physically put your hand up or put it in the chat, and then we'll call.
I don't know if I managed to stay in the 30 minutes accorded.
That's fine. It was all good and interesting. Okay, so we've got some points from Ralph, and then anyone else who wants to queue up after that, that would be great. Okay, so Ralph, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, you can hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, there's a few points I'd like to interject in there that to break apart at least a few of the assumptions, although I like in general the presentation, I'd like to make some points. This thing about Western Marxism, of course, the concept of Western Marxism is sort of an abstract concept itself. And the way that it is counterposed to Orthodox Marxism, I mean, there's a whole history of this. But I think that basic duality is a false duality. And the artificial division between supposedly scientific Marxism and humanistic Marxism, the cold and the warm stream, all of this, this very conceptual division, I think replicates the fundamental contradictions in bourgeois philosophy itself as it vacillates between scientism and irrationalism. So I've never accepted the dichotomy. So I would certainly agree that you could not assimilate Ilyenkov into this type of a category. I also think that Western Marxism is somewhat of an artificial concept in and of itself. Second point is, I didn't quite get everything you said about the old Lukács, But in terms of the young Lukács, it's interesting to look at a manuscript that was published, that was found in the archives, which is a defensive history in class consciousness called Taylism in the Dialectic, as it's published in English. Well, you know, that is actually interesting. And it's actually even more interesting than history and class consciousness, because Lukács elaborates on his conception of what his problem is with Zinoviev and with these other concepts. And it's not really anti-scientific per se. It's against a certain type of I don't have time to describe it, but it's more subtle. And he says things about the dialectics of science, which are not exactly clear, but that document is worth looking at because it's very interesting. Anyway, I'll get to my other points later because other people want to talk, right?
I'm not sure if you wanted Rogney to respond. I'll just come to David next, and then if you've got anything to say in response to the first point, and then you can at that point. Okay, David, did you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, also a question about Western Marxism. I think I don't like the term very much, because it sounds as if it covers everything going on in the West in terms of Marxism, which it certainly did not. So Western Marxism tends to refer to forms of Marxism, or self-described as Marxism, such as the Frankfurt School and others. But, you know, this was one side of the development of Marxism in the West. And with regard to your topic of Ilyenkov and Engels and dialectics of nature, I think it's important to remember that there's been a lot of important work done by Marxists in the West who don't come under the rubric of Western Marxism, such as Lucien Sèvres in France published a 200-page study with contributions from many scientists in 1998. And so I think, you know, let's not forget that there is another type of Marxism in the West other than Western Marxism.
Yeah, it is true. The very concept of Western Marxism, which we mostly have this because of Barry Anderson, I think, is very problematic. But I think that there are some features that allows us to use it. For example, this very topic of the rejection of Engels is very common in this continental Western Marxism. If you go to England, for example, you see another picture, or even the United States in the late part of the past century. You got there very interesting figures as Richard Levinson, Richard Lewontin, and so on. So definitely there, if you are from the West and you are a Marxist, that not makes you a Western Marxist. So that's a specific category. And I think that it's mostly has to do to French Marxism. But yeah, it's problematic. So it's clear this is important to be very clear to which authors we are talking about here. I was talking about the early Lukács, talking about Coyetti, talking about those people. So yeah, it is important to clarify that term.
Okay, any other questions or remarks from others? Okay, Karina.
Hi, thank you, Rogney. That was really good. I'd just like to say it's true that there are many strands of Marxism in the West and the East, and in the middle and other places. But I think it is also true to say that there was a period when Marx was the Marxist Engels tradition was being cleansed and censored out of, for example, publications of Vygotsky's writings in the United States and in England. And only recently, in the last sort of decade, have the original references been restored. And the same is obviously true of Ilyenkov himself, that he was censored and distorted to some extent in his homeland. So, I mean, what's brilliant now is that we can get the original text, we can get new translations, and get a much richer and more accurate picture than ever before. I think that's the great thing that's happening now. So I think it is correct to say that in a general sense, there was this dichotomy and this kind of division, and there has been, and there still is a huge amount of anxiety to separate Engels from Ilyenkov and from Marx, which is ridiculous, as we know they were the best, the closest collaborators. But it's still ongoing, this kind of tendency. So I think it's really, good to have this discussion. Thank you, Carol.
Okay, before we come back to Ralph, anyone else who hasn't yet spoken? Okay, Ralph, and then I'll make a brief point myself as well.
My turn again?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, yeah, about Engels, the treatment of Engels seems to fall into the same extremes of what I just described. That is, on the one extreme, the historical tendency to fuse Marx and Engels into a seamless whole, and to have the way that Marxist-Leninism was classically presented. At the other extreme, you have the sort of Engels betrayed Marx school, which is usually based upon an issue with the dialectics of nature, or in the case of Andrew Levine, his editing of Marx's Capital. I'm not going to speak to the part about Capital because I haven't really read that, but I haven't read Levine's critique. But again, I think those two extreme ways of looking at it are also part of the problem of this dichotomy, because both the proponents and opponents of Engels tend to focus on maybe Engels' most ambiguous or dubious statements and overlook the good stuff. I think that many of his Engels comments about the dialectics of nature and mathematics and various other things are very confused. But there's some really excellent aspects of Engels. One, of course, is the general concept of non-reductive materialism. But in terms of epistemology, when you see him attacking Düring and explaining the nature of analysis and synthesis against Düring's metaphysical conceptions, you see that Engels actually exhibits a dialectical way of thinking in its best way. So I think that Engels, again, has to be looked at much more concretely than simply seamlessly advocating everything he says about the dialectics of nature, or dismissing it entirely. That is, the Engels betrayed Marx school is not correct, but it's also true, I think, that Engels is kind of fudgy in the way that he unites subjective and objective dialectics, in the way that he treats the dialectics of nature. Sometimes it's kind of a mess, and I think it would be good to untangle that, as well as showing his connection to Ilyenkov. I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the idea of treating Marx as the criterion of truth, if Marx didn't agree with Engels, then Engels is wrong. That position doesn't allow us to understand Engels as an original thinker, right? So even if you are on Engels' side, you cannot simply identify Engels with Marx as they were a single person. That is, I also agree with Corina. It is ridiculous to simply say that Engels betrayed Marx and he is the devil or whatever. But it is also important to notice that he is a thinker in his own right. So we cannot simply go to these extremes of saying, oh, there is a single person, Marx Engels, or there is a different, even contradictory path between Engelsism and Marxism. That is also ridiculous. So yeah.
Okay, so a quick one from me, and then before we come back from David, if anyone who hasn't spoken just have a comment, that would be great. So there's a discussion of Ilyenkov in the context of Western Marxism in Zizek's recent Sex and the Failed Absolute, and the specific comparison he makes between the early Lukács and Ilyenkov, and I'll quote it, he's talking about intelligence of the spirit here, and he says, it remains one in the series of big evolutionary visions of the cosmos as the ontological hierarchy of levels, matter, plants, animal life, and the human spirit as the highest level known to us. And for Zizek, the big problem is around justifying ideas of hierarchy or progression within that. So I wondered what you thought about the connection and the criticism.
Yeah, I read that, and I found that very, very strange coming from Zizek, because first of all, it is a very common elementary school knowledge that there are different levels of organization of living beings, of matter in general, of whatever. This is not very, let's say, a strange claim. It is strange to claim that this is a crime, an ontological crime, as I think that he says there. So yeah, that was my first impression. But also I think that this dichotomy between Western Marxism and Soviet Marxism is present there in his writing, not explicitly, but I think that when he started talking about Lukács and this delusion of the cosmic, I think that he used that word, I don't remember, illusion of the cosmic cycle. He's not really grasping the specific content of the cosmology of the spirit. Yeah, I think that I should go back and read more carefully, but I think that it was very superficial. I really like Zizek, his analysis, but I was very disappointed when I read that.
Thanks. And before we come back to David, anyone who hasn't spoken yet, who wants to make a comment or have a question? Okay. So back to you, David.
I think Sasha had wanted to make a word.
Okay.
Am I going or not? I don't know.
No, Sasha first and then you.
Okay, thank you. I want to congratulate colleague Rodney on a wonderful report. The main thing that deserves all the support in his approach is, in my opinion, that Rodney is trying to better understand Western Marxism with the help of Ilyenkov's theoretical heritage. Whereas more often we can find attempts to study Ilyenkov in the West boils down to the exact opposite, to the attempt to interpret Ilyenkov's Marxism in terms familiar to Western academics. We fully agree with Rogney's main thesis. Ilyenkov was hostile to fashionable neo-Kantian logic, which more or less clearly assumed that objective truth is unattainable and that any attempt to resist relativism is supposedly a return to a traditions of totalitarian Stalinism. Of course, there are provisions in the report that I would like to argue with. For example, it seems unproductive to look for the roots of Ilyenkov's philosophy in the so-called Soviet philosophy. The founder of this tradition, David Buckhurst, pulled from the dusty archive the dispute of mechanists and Deboranists and told the world about the subsequent victory of the Bolshevizers. We can convince that Soviet Marxism simply existed, as there was no Soviet Marxism simply existed, sorry, as there was no Chinese or Western Marxism. Both in the USSR, in China, as well as in the West, existed, and to a large extent exists today, an ideology that calls itself Marxism. Ilyenkov didn't just propose a new national version of Marxism or develop Soviet tradition. He took a huge step towards transformation, what was commonly called Marxism, from ideology to science. But in any case, Roger's article and report represents a big step towards a serious theoretical conversation. Once again, I want to thank him for his performance.
Okay, unless Rogney wants to come back on anything there, I'll pass over to David.
Well, yes, oh, does Rogney want to come in?
No, I agree. I think that this is related to the first intervention. Actually, it's a problem with the categorization of thinkers. So I find that it's useful to some extent to do that, but it has its dangers. But either way, I think that we cannot manage without it. To some extent, we depend to set boundaries, even if they are artificial boundaries, because otherwise we cannot grasp anything. We will talking about individuals. They have nothing in common. So yeah, I agree. It is into some extent artificial, special. I will say that it is more problematic, the category of Soviet Marxism, that Western Marxism is more clear when we are talking about Western Marxism, who are those people. But Soviet Marxism is even more problematic, I agree. But I think that we have to call those people in some way or another. So it is a necessary evil, so to speak.
Thanks, David, and then Penny, I think.
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that Sasha said, and I have to say that I was really delighted with your talk, Rogney, because I think it is really important when discussing Ilyenkov to be clear about the materialist orientation of his philosophy. And I think that it's what you have suggested and what Sasha has suggested, that there is an attempt to assimilate Ilyenkov into fashionable Western ideas. And the process is, and it's not confined to the West. I think you find this in some Russian authors as well. And I think one of the indications of that for me is what I've seen recently is of Ilyenkov being described as a Soviet Hegelian. Ilyenkov was not a Hegelian, he was a Marxist. and who fully appreciated the contribution of Hegel, but he was explicitly a materialist who regarded, who thought that Hegel's dialectics had to be reworked, recast, and extended. So I really appreciate your insistence on the materialism of Ilyenkov. With regard to the discussion of Engels and Engels' relation to Marx, I mean, obviously I agree with what Ralph was saying, that we have to avoid, the evil Engels, but we also have to avoid, as you said, Rogney, the identification of Marx with Engels. They were two different people. And with regard to the development of dialectical materialism, I think it's really important to see the situation in which these texts that we are discussing were produced. After all, Engels' Dialectics of Nature were personal notes. They were not prepared for publication. Engels was borne down by his duty to edit Marx's economic manuscripts, which was a fantastic labor. So the science of his day was also only beginning to show some of the signs which he perceived, often, with great foresight. But, science has developed a lot since then. And I think, this is my main point, that we need to approach Engels critically. And I think for me, that means that when you read both Anti-Düring and the Dialectics of Nature, Engels' views are not always consistent. He has two views of dialectics. And this is interesting from the point of view of discussing Ilyenkov. So on the one hand, he represents dialectics as the general laws of motion of thought, society, and nature. And on the other hand, he talks about dialectics as the analysis of concepts to overcome the rigid dichotomies of abstract understanding. And those two things are not the same. And I think that ultimately the idea, and Ilyenkov doesn't present a critique of Engels, and maybe in Soviet conditions that was something it wasn't possible to do. But I think it is necessary to look at these personal notes, which were produced in very difficult conditions, and as Ralph was suggesting, decide the parts and the suggestions which are very useful. There are brilliant foresights in the Dialectics of Nature, but there are other things which I think are untenable. So we need a critique of these different approaches. And can I say that I think that some important elements of that critique have already been made. And I referred to the work which was produced in France by Lucien Sèvres and some scientists in 1998. And it does contain an attempt at a careful critique of Engels, which doesn't fall into the traps that Ralph mentioned of rejecting the evil Engels or identifying everything that Engels said with Marx's ideas. So I think it's important that we need to catch up with some of the research which actually has been done. But anyway, thank you for your talk. I really did appreciate it.
If there's anything,
yeah, with relation to Ilyenkov himself, I think that the chapter, I forgot the number of the chapter, it's a chapter of dialectical logic that is about the identity of logic, theory of knowledge, and dialectics. So I think that there Ilyenkov approaches with in a very intelligent fashion precisely that problem, the problem of what is the subject matter of philosophy and what is its relation with the rest of sciences. And I think that he, I don't think that it's correct here to use the word criticize, but at least he provide a very interesting interpretation of that Engels thesis of dialectics as the general, as the science of the general laws of reality and thought. So he managed to to assemble that idea with the Leninist idea of the identity of dialectics and theory of knowledge and logic, and provide an answer. So I will look into that specific chapter. And there is also an essay of Ilyenkov that is called the Worldview and Science, Dialectics and Worldview. I think that is the name of the manuscript. And there, Ilyenkov also addresses that problem. So Lucian Sev is an interesting author. I know him, but I think that we also have, even especially here that we are talking about Ilyenkov, I think that Ilyenkov did address that problem, and it has a very interesting solution to that, specifically to that, to the problem of what is materialist dialectics, what is its place in the system of knowledge. Yeah, and I think that he's coming from Engels, perhaps not to the orthodox interpretation of what Engels said, but he's definitely basing his thesis on Engels. Even in his early thesis with his friend that caused his position in the university, even there you can find very clearly his position, and he even quotes several times Engels' idea of the end of philosophy as the queen of sciences, of the end of philosophy as the metaphysics. So yeah, I think that that specific point is very, very, very interesting. Is very, very, very related to Engels. So yeah, we should look into that.
Thanks, Penny, and then if no one new wants to speak, then back to Karina. So, Penny. Yeah.
I have to apologize, Rogney. I was late in joining the talk, and in a private message to me, Corinna mentioned that you had spoken about John Holloway. And I wanted to say that what I found very powerful in your talk was this stressing of the concept of the law-governed nature of theoretical thinking, which of course is anathema to thinkers like Holloway, and that really was his big argument with Engels. You know, was the idea that there was a law. In fact, he literally said in Crack Capitalism, he said the future will not be law governed. And I think there's a sort of it's quite a trivial position to adopt, really, because it's a failure to study what law governed means when we're talking about materialist dialectics. It's not the same as capitalist law, for example, although of course the two are related. And again, I think this emerges with Zizek, with this stuff about hierarchy, that thinking is, you know, that what he objects to is the idea of theoretical thinking being the highest development, and of course that's conflating the concept of dialectic of thinking as it has developed through evolution, which was Engels' big thing, and was the reason why Stephen Jay Gould was such a big fan of Engels, because he identified how this evolved. And he's conflating it with some, I don't know, idea of capitalist hierarchies and, you know, hierarchy as a bad thing. Whereas that's not really what he's talking about at all, I don't think. So yeah, I appreciated the idea that, you know, there are law-governed processes, and to understand the nature of how these laws govern nature, society, and thought is really, it's not shutting down the future, it's actually opening up. There's a key, you know, to the future, in my view. I would like to re-listen to the recording of your talk, or perhaps see it written down, because I thought, you know, I think there's a phenomenal amount in it about, you know, the difference between theoretical thinking and the understanding of practice as a theoretical concept, as opposed to practice, activity in the world. I think there's a phenomenal amount in there which I would love to sort of study a bit more, and I think it deserves a lot of serious study. Poor old Engels, he gets a right pasting for absolutely no reason whatsoever, and I don't think Marx would have disagreed with his conception of the dialectics of nature at all. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. First of all, the topic of the laws has to do with the idea of the issue of freedom. What is freedom? People like John Holloway seems to have a voluntarist or very subjectivist idea of this. There is a very, very clear tendency in other authors. For example, there is this, is a Latin American author, it's called Nestor Cohan, who says practically the same, that the future, the communist future, will be absolutely free in the sense of no. And I think that Marx, even Marx, forget about Engels now, even Marx talk very clear about this issue. This famous passage from Capital Volume 3, where he talks about the kingdom of freedom as not, there is necessity there, but it's necessity controlled by human consciousness. So this topic of what is freedom, what is a human specific freedom as the knowledge of necessity, if it is the central topic here. And again, Ilyenkov, it is here of a great help, because he also addresses this topic. This is why I like very much Ilyenkov. I like Ilyenkov very much, because he treats the very central topics of Marxism. And you can see how there are a lot of interpretation of these issues, and some of them are frankly astonishing, ridiculous, like Holloway's and I don't know. And you can see how you can find a very intelligent answer in Ilyenkov. So yeah, I think that this is talking about how Ilyenkov is very useful today to kind of have a very good grasping of what is going on in the Marxist tradition, even right now. Also, the text that I just read is about half a paper that I wrote. I sent that paper to the journal Historical Materialism. They are reviewing it right now. Fingers crossed that they will accept it. But I can send it to you. I already sent it to Sasha. I can definitely send it to you, so you have a better idea and a better understanding, because my speaking English is not that good of what I wrote there. So if I don't know if Corina, I could send it to Corina, and then she can distribute it among you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and Corina, you wanted to ask something?
Only if nobody else wants to speak. Yeah, I thought in terms of the relevance of this discussion and this presentation by Rogney to these two texts that we circulated before the meeting. I think it's very relevant to many issues in today's world. In particular, the question of truth value, which Ilyenkov raises as a problem of the ideal. He says, I just read this on page 29. The problem of the ideal has always been an aspect of the problem of the objectivity, truth value, and Sasha will give me the Russian, it's in Russian here, istinosti, of knowledge. That is precisely the problem of those forms of knowledge that are conditioned and explained not by the whims of individual mental physiology, but by something more serious. In other words, that how do you the determination of truth, and whether we can have such a thing as truth at all, which is very much up for question today, and it has been for some time, and it's very much associated with this issue of the ideal, as Ilyenkov rightly says, and the fact that he emphasizes the sharp division between the ideal and the material, that the neither can be reduced to the other, is a really, I think it's absolutely fundamental, not just for understanding Ilyenkov, but for grappling with social and also scientific issues in today's world. I mean, I attended a talk by a leading cosmologist where really they were talking about the world being only a simulacrum, or only, you know, everything is a simulacrum, and it's not, we can't really grasp anything beyond our own knowledge, that there is anything beyond our own knowledge. So I think in that respect it's extremely essential, and it goes along, I'll wind up in a minute, but along with this very predominant use of the word praxis in many, many different authors and theoreticians and sociologists and political activists, especially, with maybe a genuine desire not to become ivory tower speculation, but to engage in real transformational activity. But then the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, because by merging in this unclear way these different aspects of our world, we can lose both on the one hand the natural material world, or on the other hand the development of the ideal. They either of them can get lost, and I think that's why it's so valuable to have this showing the connection between the dialectics of nature, Engels, and Ilyenkov, because I'll just finish a minute, because Ilyenkov explored he wrote the first essay in 1960. Dialectics of the Ideal was written in the mid-70s. He went through an evolution in his own thought. He realized that there was this huge gap in the development of Marxism. He knew that, which was the exploration of the ideal and the subject, the development of the subject, the development of knowledge. So he was trying to explore that and develop it, knowing there was this huge gap. And that's why he was attacking the physiological, neurological kind of reductionism. But it's bigger than that, just that period. And I think that's why it's so relevant for today, because the need to start with today, with the imminent logic of today, is what he's stressing. And that, I think that has a lot of significance. Thank you. Sorry to go on.
Yeah, the main thing about that is that Ilyenkov always related the problem of the ideal with the problem of truth. And this is I think that this is a very important topic, because what is true for Ilyenkov has to do with an identity of thought and being, not only coherent speech of logical, perfect internal structure of knowledge. Is not specifically worried about that. He's worried about how knowledge can reflect, and this word is very despised by some Marxists, where it's there in the Marxist tradition, reflect the objective reality. And if objective reality doesn't have a structure, an internal immanent structure to be reflected by knowledge, then we cannot talking about knowledge at all. So, and this is also related with Ilyenkov thought about education, about how we should address the educational process, because he thought that knowledge is, by definition, knowledge of the object. So if there is not object to know, then we cannot know anything. So it's important to have in mind that there is always this relation between gnoseology or epistemology and ontology when we are talking about the ideal. It's not talking about human thought, it's also talking about the structure of the world in thought. So that is, I think, very crucial in Ilyenkov thought, is the very definition. And also, when he defines the ideal in dialectics of the ideal specifically, he mentions several times that it's not only the ideal objects, not only reflects other material objects, it's not only the reflection between a sign, let's say the word glass, and the object glass. It's the ideal object is reflecting the universal nature of the object. So the category of the universal as a system of interaction, of objective material interaction, is, I think, the keystone here. And this, I think that this has been overlooked for some, for the scholars that are right now studying Ilyenkov. It is not simply as a relation of representation of material objects, because if were that, it's a very symbolic relation, a more or less arbitrary relation between sign and what is signified by that sign. It's the representation of the universal nature. And what is the conception of universal, of concrete universal that Ilyenkov has? That is the central issue in the correct understanding of the ideal. And the universal interaction is what Engels talked practically the entire book of Dialectics of Nature. It's a system of universal interaction of objects in nature. So that is what I'm calling your attention. That's as I want to call your attention, your eye, the concept of interaction as the key to understand what is the universe, the concrete universal for Ilyenkov. I think that this concept is key. And for example, when I read Alex Levin's introduction, which was great, this topic was completely passed over. I didn't see it at all. I think perhaps it was me that didn't read it properly, but I think that this is crucial and we are not addressing it.
Great, thanks a lot, Rogney. Unless someone who hasn't spoken yet wants to make any contribution, I think we'll start to wind up. Okay, great. I think we'll leave it there.
Carol, could I just ask, there's a lot of, Rogney, a lot of people have further points, and would it be possible maybe to resume this discussion at a later point, maybe in, I don't know, late in August or early September? Because Sasha Somava is doing our next session, which is early August. And I don't know if people want to take a break or not, or have another session late in August. How do you feel, Rogney?
Yeah, sure. And actually, it would be the best for me to send you the written paper so you can read it with time and we can have a better discussion. It has been wonderful. I think that this is I know this is a very polemic. There are lots of different opinions in this topic. This is a very difficult one too. But I think that it's crucial to see how, not because the figure of Engels in itself, but how the Marxist philosophy in general relates to the sciences and to nature in itself is a topic for today with the whole ecological crisis and so on. So yeah, I think that we can definitely do that. I'm up to it. So
Rogney, quite a lot of people saying they'd like to do the historical and logical, focus on that next time.
Yeah, sure. We can discuss the text. I think that this is very, because it deals with the problem of the category, the Hegelian category of aim in nature, and how the category of interaction overcomes that category without fully negating. So I think that it's crucial to understand the role of Engels in Ilyenkov. So yeah, we can do that. So I don't know how it works. I don't know how we could do it or when, but yeah, you can count on me.
Great.